Dean Martin refused to speak to Sinatra for 10 years. The friendship the world thought was unbreakable. In the golden glow of mid-century Hollywood, when neon lights washed Las Vegas boulevards in promise and music spilled from every open door, two names rose above the rest like twin stars locked in orbit: Dean Martin and Frank Sinatra. To the public, they were effortless, untouchable, men who laughed louder than the rooms they entered and sang as if sound itself had been invented for their voices. Wherever one appeared, the other was never far behind. Their friendship was not marketed, it was witnessed. It lived in sideways glances on stage, in private jokes that broke them both mid-song, in the way Dean's relaxed warmth softened Frank's sharp intensity. Together they were balance. Fire and velvet, discipline and rebellion, and for years the world believed nothing could ever come between them. They met when ambition still burned hotter than fame, when nights were long and stages were small, and every performance felt like a test of survival. Frank was already known for his relentless pursuit of excellence, for the way he treated every note like a promise that could not be broken. Dean was different. Dean carried himself like a man who had already won, even when he hadn't. He made struggle look like charm, failure like a joke. Yet beneath the casual grin was a man who listened deeply, who felt more than he showed, and who saw in Frank something familiar: hunger, yes, but also loneliness. Over time, what began as professional respect turned into something closer to brotherhood. They didn't just perform together, they leaned on each other. When one succeeded, the other celebrated. When one stumbled, the other stood in front of him. By the early 1960s, their bond had fused into legend, alongside Sammy Davis Jr. and the rest of the Rat Pack. They weren't merely entertainers, they were a moving culture. Las Vegas bent around them, Hollywood chased them. Their shows weren't rehearsed so much as unleashed. Audiences came for the music and stayed for the feeling that they were watching real friendship unfold in real time. Frank would command a room with precision, and Dean would dismantle it with humor. Frank built the fire. Dean warmed it, and when they stood side by side under stage lights, it looked like permanence. But permanence is often an illusion created by noise. Behind the curtain, the rhythm was changing. Frank's focus sharpened as his empire expanded. Every appearance became a statement, every collaboration a calculation. He was building something that could not afford cracks. Dean, meanwhile, felt the weight of years pressing differently against him. He loved the stage, but he loved quiet more. He loved the audience, but he loved his children in a way fame could not compete with. While Frank chased legacy, Dean began craving peace. And the more Frank accelerated, the more Dean slowed. At first, the differences were small, missed dinners, shortened conversations, a growing list of commitments that pulled them in opposite directions. Nothing dramatic, nothing public, just the soft beginning of emotional distance. The late 1960s came roaring in with cultural upheaval and personal reckoning. The Rat Pack's chaos, once intoxicating, began to exhaust Dean. The endless nights, the constant expectation to perform even off stage, the unspoken demand that he always be on. He was no longer 20, he was a father. A man whose private world mattered as much as his public one, and quietly, without fully realizing it, Dean started stepping back. Fewer appearances, more refusals. More time away. To him, it felt like survival. To Frank, it felt like abandonment. The tension did not explode, it thickened. There were meetings that ended too quickly, phone calls that didn't happen, invitations that weren't answered. Frank, who gave loyalty like law, began to feel something unfamiliar creeping into his chest: doubt. He had always believed that Dean was the one person who would never leave the circle, never loosen the bond. And now, without a single argument he could point to, he felt himself standing alone at the center of something they had built together. He didn't confront Dean directly. That was Frank's way. Instead, he grew colder, more formal, more distant. Pride filled the space where conversation should have been. Dean felt it, of course he did, but he didn't know how to speak it. He had never been good at heavy conversations. He was the man who dissolved discomfort into humor, who sang instead of explained. And the more strained things became, the more he avoided the subject altogether. He told himself Frank would understand. He told himself time would smooth it over. He told himself wrong things. Then came the decision that changed everything. In 1969, Dean walked away from the Rat Pack. Not in anger, not in scandal, but firmly. He stepped back from the late nights, the group performances, the chaos that had once defined him. To the world, it looked like a career move. To Frank, it felt like a verdict. No long conversation preceded it, no private reconciliation, just distance, formalities, and then absence. Frank took it personally because to him it was personal. It wasn't about shows, it was about loyalty, about history. About the silent contract he believed they had signed with their lives. After that, the calls stopped. The jokes disappeared. The shared rooms became separate hotels. And slowly, without a press release or a public argument, two men who had once seemed inseparable entered a silence so complete it startled even those closest to them. Months passed, then years. Dean threw himself into family life, into quieter projects, into the parts of himself he had postponed for decades. On the surface, he was fine, successful, respected. But in quiet moments when the house settled and memories had room to speak, Frank's absence sat heavy. There were songs he couldn't hear anymore, jokes he didn't repeat, places in Las Vegas he avoided because they still carried the sound of laughter that no longer existed. Frank, for his part, continued forward. Bigger stages, sharper control, a career that never slowed, but something in him had hardened. Those who knew him well noticed the difference. He still commanded rooms, but he lingered less in them. He still sang of love, but the warmth in his voice carried an undertone of something unresolved. Pride kept him from reaching out. Hurt kept him from admitting why. And so the years stacked. 1 became 3. 3 became 5. 5 became 10. 10 years without a phone call. 10 years without a shared meal. 10 years without the one man who had once stood closer than a brother. The world moved on, assuming what it always assumes, that great friendships end when great egos collide. That time replaces people. That success erases need. But inside both men, something unfinished waited. And in the quiet of the late 1970s, as age softened edges fame never could, that unfinished thing began to stir. Dean Martin was no longer running from reflection. And Frank Sinatra was no longer certain he wanted to. Somewhere ahead, without headlines or stages, a moment was approaching that neither man could have predicted. A moment when pride would finally loosen its grip, and 10 years of silence would come face to face with the one question neither had ever dared to ask. What if we were wrong? The decade that changed them both. The first year after Dean walked away from the Rat Pack did not feel like a decade in the making. At first, it felt temporary, like a pause that would naturally correct itself. Dean told himself that space would do what arguments never could, that Frank would cool down, that they would eventually find their way back into the same room and laugh about how dramatic it had all seemed. He focused on home, on routines he had rarely allowed himself to keep before. Mornings without airports. Evenings without stage lights. Dinners that did not begin after midnight. To the outside world, it looked like a man finally enjoying the rewards of success. But success, without the people who built it with you, carries a strange hollowness. Dean felt it in the quiet moments, when laughter faded too quickly and memories arrived without invitation. There were jokes he could not finish because Frank's voice was missing from the room. There were songs he could not sing without hearing harmony that no longer came. Frank, meanwhile, buried himself in motion. He performed, recorded, negotiated, planned, expanded. His calendar became a fortress. If he kept moving, nothing could catch him. If he filled every hour, there would be no room for reflection. To the public, he was stronger than ever, sharper, more commanding, more controlled. But control often grows where hurt is denied. Frank had not lost just a partner. He had lost the one man who spoke to him without fear, who laughed at him when others flattered, who could walk into his space without asking permission. Frank did not talk about it. He changed the subject. He hardened his standards. He demanded more from those around him. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the warmth that had once softened his intensity began to recede. As the years passed, the silence did not ease. It calcified. Birthdays came and went without calls. Milestones passed without acknowledgement. Awards were received without congratulations. Each unspoken moment made the next one heavier. Pride is rarely loud. It is quiet. It convinces you that reaching out would cost more than loneliness ever could. Dean felt it every time his hand hovered near a phone he did not pick up. Frank felt it every time he heard Dean's name mentioned in rooms he pretended not to hear. There were nights when Dean would sit alone after dinner, a glass untouched in front of him, the television glowing with sound he wasn't listening to, and find himself thinking not about stages or applause, but about the early days. About cheap hotels and shared jokes and long drives where the future still felt like a rumor. He remembered the way Frank used to listen when he sang, head tilted slightly, eyes half closed, as if weighing each note. He remembered the look Frank wore when something truly moved him, a look he rarely let the world see. Those memories did not hurt sharply. They ached, like weather in old bones. Frank's nights were different but no less heavy. After performances, after the lights went down and the rooms emptied, he often lingered. He did not rush back to silence. He stood at bars longer than he needed to, sat in lounges after others left, let conversations drift without steering them, and in those spaces, Dean surfaced. Someone would make a joke that Dean would have made better. Someone would sing a song Dean used to lean into. Someone would laugh in a way that carried echoes. Frank never spoke the name aloud, but those close enough could see it in the way his jaw tightened, in the way his eyes darkened briefly before he masked it. Time did what it always does. It reshaped them. Dean grew quieter. He still smiled easily, still charmed rooms when he entered them, but he no longer lingered in crowds. He preferred conversations over performances, dinners over events, early mornings over late nights. He found comfort in routines, in predictability, in being known without being watched. But even in that comfort, there was a missing presence. Someone who had known him before he learned to play himself. Someone who had seen the uncertainty behind the ease. Frank grew more introspective. His voice deepened not just in tone, but in feeling. There was weight in it now, a gravity that audiences recognized even if they did not understand it. He sang of regret and endurance and time not as themes, but as lived realities. He still commanded admiration, but admiration is not companionship. And as the years accumulated, he became increasingly aware that success had not replaced what he had lost. Neither man spoke to the other, but neither forgot. 10 years is long enough for memories to fade, but not long enough for unfinished bonds to dissolve. It is long enough for anger to cool into something more complicated, something quieter, something closer to regret. Dean began to realize that his need for distance had been real, but so had the damage it caused. He had never intended to disappear. He had never intended to wound. He had simply wanted space. But intentions do not soften consequences. And the older he grew, the more clearly he could see that walking away without explanation had not been peace. It had been avoidance. Frank's realization came more slowly. He had spent years framing the silence as strength, as dignity, as refusal to chase what had chosen to leave. But dignity can become armor, and armor grows heavy. There were moments now when he wondered what might have happened if he had spoken instead of withdrawn, if he had asked instead of assumed. He wondered how many years two stubborn men could lose without either truly winning. By the late 1970s, the noise of their lives had softened. The pace was no longer frantic. The urgency that once drove them had loosened its grip. Reflection found more space. And in that space, the absence of the other man no longer felt like proof of strength. It felt like an open question. Dean began to talk about Frank again, cautiously, only to those he trusted. Not with bitterness, but with a strange mixture of fondness and heaviness. He spoke of old nights, old stages, old laughter. He did not speak of blame. He spoke of time, of how quickly it moves, of how quietly it takes things with it. And somewhere inside him, the thought began to form not as a plan, but as a pull. Frank, too, softened. He listened when Dean's name surfaced. He did not change the subject as quickly. He allowed himself to smile at old stories. He allowed himself occasionally to admit what those closest to him had always known. That he missed him. Not the performer. Not the partner. The friend. The man who had once stood beside him when the world was still being figured out. By 1979, both men were older, more measured, less certain that time was something to be spent, and more aware that it was something being used whether they chose to or not. And though neither had yet spoken the words aloud, both were circling the same truth from opposite directions. Whatever had been broken between them could no longer be blamed on the past. Only on the present. And the present was running out of excuses. Somewhere in Las Vegas, preparations were underway for a show that would gather old names, old memories, old audiences. To the world, it would look like entertainment. To Dean Martin, it began to feel like something else entirely. A doorway. And on the other side of it waited a man he had not seen in 10 years. The room where silence ended. By the time 1979 arrived, Dean Martin no longer mistook busyness for peace. He had spent years convincing himself that quiet routines and controlled distance were enough, that stepping away from the chaos of his past had healed whatever needed healing. But age has a way of peeling away the comfortable stories we tell ourselves. The older he grew, the more often his mind returned not to stages or accolades, but to moments of unguarded humanity, the kind that only exist between people who have walked long roads together. And whenever those moments surfaced, Frank was there. Not as a performer, not as a legend. As the man who had once been closer than anyone else, the man who had seen him without the shield of charm, the man he had never truly replaced. The invitation to Las Vegas should have felt routine, Another appearance. Another gathering of old names and familiar faces, but this one pressed differently against him. It carried weight not because of the audience it promised, but because of the city itself. Las Vegas was not neutral ground. It was memory made of neon. It was where they had ruled, laughed, argued, triumphed, and quietly drifted apart. And as Dean considered the trip, he realized with uncomfortable clarity that he no longer wanted to walk into that city carrying unfinished business. Not at his age, not with the years already behind him. The thought came without drama, without fanfare. It arrived simply and refused to leave. He wanted to see Frank. Not on a stage. Not across a room. Not through intermediaries. He wanted to sit with him. The realization unsettled him because it stripped away every excuse he had leaned on for a decade. If he reached out, there would be no performance to hide behind, no shared spotlight to diffuse the weight of what needed to be said. It would be only 2 men and 10 years of silence. Dean was not afraid of confrontation, but he had always been wary of emotional exposure. Humor had been his armor, ease his disguise, and this meeting would offer neither. For days, the decision lived inside him without action. He replayed old conversations, imagined reactions, wondered whether Frank would refuse, wondered whether he deserved anything else. Pride still whispered its familiar warnings, that reopening old wounds could create new ones, that silence at least had boundaries. But time whispered louder, time which had already taken enough without asking permission, time which did not negotiate. Dean finally spoke to a mutual friend, someone who still moved easily between both worlds, someone who could reach Frank without spectacle. The message he offered was simple, almost painfully so. He did not craft explanations. He did not defend himself. He did not revisit history. He said only that he would be in Las Vegas, that he hoped Frank would agree to meet, that it did not need to be public, that it did not need to be about anything except conversation. When the response came back that Frank had agreed, Dean did not feel relief. He felt gravity, because agreement meant the past was no longer something to think about. It was something to face. Frank Sinatra did not spend the days before the meeting rehearsing speeches. He did not ask what Dean intended to say. He did not prepare himself with bravado or bitterness. Outwardly, nothing changed. His schedule remained full, his manner steady, but those closest to him noticed a difference in the quiet moments, a restlessness, a longer gaze, a tendency to sit without speaking when he normally filled space. For years, he had told himself that the silence had been mutual, chosen, justified. Now it had a date, and dates have a way of transforming abstraction into reality. He thought of Dean not as he was now, but as he had been, the man who had once walked into rooms and made them feel lighter, the man who had stood beside him when his own intensity threatened to swallow him whole. Frank had never been good at naming loss while it was happening. He had always recognized it later when it could no longer be changed. This time, for once, it was not too late, but knowing that did not make the meeting easier. It made it heavier. Because what was about to happen could not be undone. Whatever was said would exist. Whatever remained unspoken would remain that way forever. Afternoon of the meeting arrived without drama. No reporters waited. No crowds gathered. Dean came alone, without an entourage, without ceremony, and walked through familiar corridors that felt strangely distant, as if he were moving through a version of his life that no longer belonged to him. The hotel suite was quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that magnifies small sounds, that turns footsteps into announcements. When the door opened, there was no immediate greeting, no embrace, no humor, just space. Frank stood near the bar, a glass in his hand, his posture composed but his eyes alert. He had aged as Dean had. The sharpness softened by time, the fire steadied into something more reflective. For a long moment, neither man moved. 10 years collapsed into the few feet between them. All the nights, all the shows, all the arguments never spoken, all the words rehearsed and abandoned, seemed to gather invisibly in that air. Dean felt the instinct to make it lighter, to turn the moment into something casual. It had always been his way, but something in him resisted it. This was not a stage. This was not an entrance. This was not something to perform. So he walked forward slowly, letting the silence breathe instead of killing it. When he spoke, his voice was softer than he expected. "You look good," he said, the words simple, unguarded. Frank's mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile, not quite restraint. "So do you, Dino," he replied. And then, after a pause that felt deliberate rather than awkward, he added, "Older, but good." Dean nodded. He could have joked. He could have deflected. Instead, he said the one thing that had lived inside him for years without form. "I've missed you." The words did not echo, they landed. Frank did not answer immediately. He took a slow breath, set the glass down, and looked at Dean not as an audience looks at a legend, but as a man looks at someone he has known too long to pretend with. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I have too." It was not dramatic. There were no raised voices, no accusations, no apologies yet, but something fundamental shifted. The silence that had once felt like a wall now felt like a door that had been opened and left ajar. They sat, not opposite each other like negotiators, but near, close enough to feel presence without crowding it. The conversation did not begin with explanations. It began with memory, with small things, with places, with names. With laughter that surprised both of them when it arrived, hesitant at first, then easier. They spoke of the old days not as heroes revisiting triumphs, but as men recalling youth. They talked about chaos, about travel, about nights they barely remembered and moments they never forgot. And as the tension softened, the years between them began to reveal themselves not as a single wound, but as many small ones layered together. Pride, misunderstanding, exhaustion, fear of saying the wrong thing, fear of hearing the wrong thing. Eventually, inevitably, the conversation moved where it had avoided for a decade. Frank spoke first. He did not accuse, he admitted. He spoke of how Dean's departure had not felt like a career move, but like a personal erasure. Of how he had believed, perhaps foolishly, that whatever changed, they would not. Of how he had waited at first, then hardened, then convinced himself that silence was dignity. He spoke of how many times he had almost reached out, and how many times he had stopped himself because he did not know what he would say without sounding wounded. And Frank Sinatra did not like sounding wounded. Dean listened, without interruption, without humor, and when he spoke it was not to defend himself. It was to explain what he had never known how to put into words before. He spoke of exhaustion that had turned invisible even to him, of a life that had begun to feel like an obligation rather than a choice, of love for the rat pack that had slowly tangled with a need to escape it. He spoke of family, of wanting to be present in ways fame never allowed, of not knowing how to step back without hurting the people he cared about most, of choosing distance instead of conversation, and of realizing far too late that distance explains nothing. There was no moment where everything resolved, but there was a moment where both men stopped protecting themselves from the truth. And in that room, for the first time in 10 years, silence no longer belonged to them. What Dean finally said. The room did not feel the same once the truth had been spoken. Something heavy had been laid down between them, not as a burden but as an offering. Years of misinterpretation, pride, and emotional restraint had been named, and in being named they lost some of their power. The silence that once separated them now felt like a chapter rather than a sentence. They did not rush to fill the space with jokes or nostalgia. They let it breathe. They let it settle. Two men who had spent their lives performing now sat in a moment where nothing needed to be performed at all. Frank leaned back slightly, studying Dean with an openness he rarely allowed anyone. "So why now?" he asked, not suspiciously, but with the quiet curiosity of someone who genuinely wanted to understand. "Why after all this time?" Dean did not answer immediately. He looked around the room as if gathering something from the walls, from the air, from the years that seemed to be standing there with them. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, but it carried a weight Frank had never heard in it before. "Because I realized something that scared me," Dean said. "I realized I could get older and older, quieter and quieter, and one day I wouldn't remember what your voice sounded like unless it was on a record. And that felt wrong. Not sad, wrong. Like something unfinished was trying to turn into something permanent." Frank's expression changed at that. The guarded composure he had worn since Dean entered the room softened into something exposed. Dean continued, not dramatically, not loudly, but with a clarity that had been forming for years. "I told myself I left for the right reasons, and maybe I did, but I also left without telling you the truth. And the truth is, I didn't walk away from the music. I walked away because I was afraid of losing myself, and in doing that, I lost you instead. And that's not a trade I would ever make again." The words did not shock because they were loud. They shocked because they were complete. Frank had heard many apologies in his life, many confessions, many explanations, but this was not any of those. It was ownership. It was the kind of sentence that closes a door and opens another. Frank did not respond immediately. He stared at the floor for a moment, his jaw working slightly as if he were holding something in place. When he looked back up, his eyes were wet, though his voice did not break. "You know," he said quietly, "I spent years telling myself I didn't miss you. I missed what we did. The shows, the nights, the sound, but that wasn't it. I missed the one guy in the room who didn't want anything from me." He exhaled slowly, then added, "I didn't lose a partner when you left. I lost the one place I didn't have to be Frank Sinatra." That was the moment, not the greeting, not the laughter, not even the truth that had come before. That sentence changed the room because it revealed what the silence had actually cost. Not opportunity, not legacy, safety, understanding, the rare comfort of being seen without being measured. Dean's face tightened, and for a brief second the effortless mask he had worn for a lifetime fell away. "I never wanted to be something you had to carry," he said. "I just didn't know how to tell you I needed to put something down." They did not embrace. They did not need to. They sat there, closer now, not physically but emotionally, in a way that felt more intimate than any public reunion could have been. The rest of the afternoon passed without structure. They talked about families, about regrets that had nothing to do with fame, about the strange feeling of outliving versions of themselves. They laughed more easily. The sound was different now, not reckless, not performative, warm, familiar, real. When they eventually stood to leave, there was no grand declaration, no promise to reclaim the past, but there was something more enduring. There was intention. Frank extended his hand, not as a gesture of formality, but as acknowledgement. Dean took it then, without hesitation, pulled him into a brief, firm embrace that surprised them both. It was not dramatic. It was not long, but it was enough to say what words no longer needed to. Their reconnection did not unfold in headlines. It unfolded in dinners, in phone calls, in quiet visits. They did not rush back into performance or nostalgia. They rebuilt the way older men do, carefully, without illusion. They allowed themselves to be who they were now, not who the world remembered. Sometimes they talked about the past. Sometimes they didn't. The friendship they were restoring was not a museum. It was a living thing. In 1981, when Dean appeared quietly at one of Frank's concerts, the audience felt something before they understood it. There was applause, yes, but there was also recognition. Two men sitting near each other, not as legends, but as survivors of time. Dean did not sing that night. He did not need to. The moment was not about sound. It was about presence. Frank acknowledged him not with ceremony, but with a look that carried decades inside it. And in that look was gratitude. Not for reunion, for return. They remained connected in the years that followed, not loudly, not publicly, but faithfully. When Dean's health declined, Frank was there. When Dean passed away in 1995, Frank did not speak of charts or careers or eras. He spoke of loss, of missing something that could never be replaced, of a friendship that had endured even when it had been buried. The real story of Dean Martin and Frank Sinatra was never just the music. It was the proof that even the strongest bonds can fracture without ever fully breaking. That pride can steal years, but it does not have to steal endings. That silence can become a prison, but it can also become a doorway if someone is brave enough to open it. Dean was that someone. And what he finally said did not shock because it was poetic. It shocked because it was true.